Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're going to explore something maybe a bit subtle, but really significant in our workplaces. We're looking at the impact of people sometimes called non-criminal psychopaths.
Right. And based on our sources, these are people who show those core psychopathic traits. You know, less empathy, less guilt, very self-interested, always calculating. But the key thing here is they stay within the law. Their influence, though, often hidden, but it can be really negative.
Yeah, and it's quite likely, you might have run into someone like this, maybe that colleague who's super ambitious, charming, but it feels a bit forced. Or a manager whose decisions always make sense on paper, but somehow always seem to boost their own standing.
Exactly.
So our goal today is really to unpack that, give you a framework to understand these kinds of patterns. We'll look at the manipulation tactics they use, how they can kind of warp the ethics of a place, and the real effects on colleagues.
hmm Ultimately, we want to get a handle on how these people function inside organizations and the insidious damage they cause. Hopefully give you some insights to spot it and, navigate those difficult dynamics.
Okay, so let's start by digging into the core traits. What are we actually seeing here?
Well, fundamentally, as the sources suggest, it often starts with a real lack of emotional empathy. They get emotions on an intellectual level. They can see someone's upset.
But they don't feel it themselves.
Exactly. They don't feel that distress. And that emotional distance, that's what enables some very calculated manipulation. Like they might spot a colleague going through a rough time, and instead of offering support, they see it as leverage.
Yeah, leverage for their own gain. It's that detached, almost cold quality that jumps out.
And tied right into that is this extreme self-centeredness. It's more than just being ambitious, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. It's a consistent pattern of putting their own wants and goals first, often, directly making things harder for others. Right. How does that actually show up day to day? Things that maybe aren't fireable offenses, but still cause problems.
Well, think about the person who always seems to grab the credit for team wins, or the one who's incredibly skilled at dodging blame when something goes wrong. They might even twist facts just slightly to make themselves look better. Little things, maybe, but add them up.
And it just eats away at trust and morale.
Precisely. It can really poison the well over time.
And then there's the decision making. Calculated, detached. As you mentioned that. I mean, rationality sounds good in business, right? But when it consistently ignores the human costs.
It creates this unease, this feeling that something's off, especially for people working closely with them. And what's really telling is how they view relationships, often purely transactional.
So it's not about connection. It's about what can you do for me?
Pretty much. It's about how others fit into their plans. And that makes building real trust, real collaboration, almost impossible within their teams.
Okay, which brings us to something tricky. Manipulation that stays technically legal. They seem to have a real talent for walking that line, doing things that feel wrong but don't necessarily break rules.
Yeah, the sources talk a lot about psychological manipulation, subtly undermining colleagues, stuff that's hard to pin down, hard to prove, maybe doesn't even lead to a formal complaint.
But still incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. Causes real stress, damages the work environment. Even if it stays under the radar legally, it's a kind of invisible harm.
And sadly, as the sources point out, these manipulative skills often help them get ahead. They climb the ladder.
That's the paradox, isn't it? M. Scott Peck noted how good they can be at manipulating. Their charm, their persuasiveness, it works in hierarchies. And once they're in the leadership roles, their power to push their own agenda, often hurting the organization, just grows.
Which must have a knock-on effect on ethics. It's not just one person's behavior anymore.
No, it can start to erode the standards for everyone. They can create these pockets or even whole environments where dodgy practices become okay, maybe even encouraged, especially if it gets short-term results.
Right.
And that normalization, that's really dangerous long-term.
And it goes beyond just one company, right? The sources touch on bigger societal impacts, too.
That's right. When these individuals get into really influential roles, think politics, big business, their decisions ripple outwards. That lack of empathy, that focus on personal gain over the common good. Peck mentioned this too, their lack of social responsibility. It can lead to decisions that harm a lot of people, even while technically following the letter of the law.
Makes you think about the kind of influence they can wield. Okay, so we've defined the traits. How do they actually exert this influence day to day in an organization?
Well, a big one seems to be using their social status, the positions of power they manage to get.
Right, the higher up they go, the more tools they have to manipulate.
Exactly. Naito Yoshihiro's research touches on this, how people in authority can exploit their role for their own ends. Again, maybe not illegal, but it could really damage morale and the company's integrity.
And a key part of that seems to be how good they are at reading people, exploiting emotions. It's like a twisted kind of emotional intelligence.
That's a good way to put it. They can often spot vulnerabilities, hopes, fears, and then use that knowledge strategically. Plus, the sources often mention charisma. They can be incredibly charming, persuasive, especially when they need something.
Which makes it hard to see the manipulation at first. You might just think they're a strong leader or good with people.
That's the danger. And they're often very strategic about building relationships, but only with key decision makers. They cultivate this image of being essential, indispensable, build connections that shield them from criticism.
Very calculated networking, not about mutual support, more about protection and advancement.
And within their own teams. The sources say they sometimes create a pretty toxic environment, stirring up competition, tension between colleagues.
Ah, the classic divide and rule. Keep everyone else off balance, maybe fighting each other.
Exactly. It reinforces their own position as the one in control, the stable one amid the chaos they might have helped create.
Wow. And information control seems key too. Twisting facts, exaggerating their wins.
Oh, definitely. Masters of spin when it comes to their own achievements, and equally good at downplaying failures or shifting blame.
We've probably all seen that the person whose role in a success magically grows while someone else gets blamed for any problems. It kills team spirit.
And it extends to building these false images of themselves, making themselves seem vital while maybe subtly undermining rivals, damaging reputations, isolating people.
So it's a two-pronged attack.
Right.
Build yourself up, tear others down.
Right. And again, think bigger picture. When people like this get into really powerful positions in society, that lack of empathy, that willingness to manipulate, it can erode public trust, destabilize things. Legal, maybe. Harmful, often, yes.
That lack of empathy seems central to all of this. Let's dive deeper into its specific impact.
It really shapes everything they do. The sources often describe it as seeing other people basically as tools, objects to be used for their own goals.
Which is chilling. If you don't genuinely care how your actions affect others, it's much easier to make decisions that benefit you, regardless of the fallout.
Especially in leadership roles, where you're supposed to care about your team's well-being.
Right. A leader without empathy might push people way too hard, set impossible deadlines, ignore burnout.
The examples given are exactly that: unrealistic demands, ignoring stress levels, just focusing on the target, their target, without thinking about the human cost. It makes employees feel completely devalued, leads to disengagement, people leaving, high turnover.
And even just among colleagues, not necessarily in a boss-subordinate relationship, that lack of empathy is disruptive, right?
Absolutely. Someone who constantly dismisses other people's ideas, steamrolls conversations, maybe exploits colleagues by taking credit or shifting blame. It breeds resentment, distrust, creates a really unstable, unpleasant atmosphere.
We mentioned manipulation before, but the sources explicitly link lack of empathy to emotional manipulation, which makes sense. If you don't care about feelings, you're more likely to use them.
Precisely. They can use fear, guilt, even charm or flattery, purely strategically, without worrying about the emotional damage they might be causing. Pitting team members against each other is a classic tactic mentioned. Might look like it boosts competition short term, but it destroys team unity.
And does this lack of empathy make them more prone to, well, unethical behavior generally, less held back by conscience?
The sources draw a pretty clear line there. If you don't connect with the potential harm to others, you're just less constrained by ethical boundaries. So yeah, they're potentially more likely to engage in anything from manipulative office politics right up to, fraud or creating exploitative policies if it serves them. And leaders like this can normalize it.
It's like a ripple effect. One person's lack of ethics can start to lower the bar for the whole organization.
Exactly. And it fundamentally kills cooperation and trust. If people are just out for themselves, how do you build a team culture? We see examples where leaders manipulate team members just to consolidate their own power or stir up rivalry purely to stay on top. Short-term wins, maybe, but it weakens the whole structure.
And the psychological toll on the employees stuck in that kind of environment. The stress, anxiety, feeling isolated, it must be huge.
Definitely impacts job satisfaction, mental well-being, and the long-term damage to the organization is real too. Prioritizing short-term gains, eroding trust, hurting the company's reputation. It makes it really hard to keep good people. These aren't just personality issues. They have real business consequences.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to how this plays out in terms of power struggles within organizations. That seems to be a major theme.
Absolutely. That relentless drive for power seems to be a core motivator for these individuals in a work context. They're constantly maneuvering.
How do they do that? Is it just schmoozing the right people?
That's part of it. Manipulating relationships, leveraging connections with influential people to climb the ladder. They get good at making themselves seem indispensable. But often, it also involves, as the sources say, subtly undermining colleagues. Not always overt attacks, but chipping away at credibility, creating suspicion.
Right. And they might even deliberately stir up trouble, create conflict.
Yeah, that's a key tactic. Provoke competition, create divisions, then position themselves as the calm, confident one who can fix it. Like sowing discord in a project team just to make themselves look better by comparison. It's about enhancing their own perceived value.
And if things go wrong, blame someone else, quickly.
That seems to be the default. They're masters at spinning narratives to assign responsibility elsewhere, protecting themselves above all. If a project fails, they'll find a scapegoat, paint themselves as the victim or the hero who tried to save it. It fuels conflict and kills trust.
And information becomes a weapon in this power game too, right? Controlling who knows what.
Definitely. Twisting facts, sharing information selectively. It's all about controlling the narrative to their advantage. They might hype their own role to senior management while downplaying what colleagues did or maybe highlighting their mistakes.
Which leads to unfairness, resentment, and potentially bad decisions if leaders are acting on bad information.
Exactly. And long-term, this constant maneuvering and backstabbing really poisons the culture. Ethical standards start to slip everywhere.
Because if you see self-serving manipulative behavior being rewarded, maybe even modeled by leaders,
It sends a message that that's how you get ahead. Integrity gets sidelined. The organization's ethical compass gets weaker and weaker.
and it must just destroy genuine communication and teamwork if everyone's suspicious of everyone else.
Precisely. These individuals tend to keep relationships superficial. There's no real basis for trust. So you end up with this atmosphere of isolation, skepticism. People are less motivated, less willing to collaborate, and ultimately the organization suffers.
So this hunger for power, combined with the lack of empathy and self-interest, it's incredibly destructive. Let's look more closely now at the specific ethical problems that stem from this lack of morality.
Well, it seems almost baked in, doesn't it? If you lack that core moral compass, ethical challenges are bound to arise, especially in positions of power.
So prioritizing personal gain over ethics is just standard operating procedure.
The sources suggest it's a defining trait. They're often willing to use deception, bend or break rules, ignore ethical norms if it gets them what they want. A stark example is disregarding compliance rules to hit short-term targets, or pressuring employees into legally gray areas, framing it as necessary when it's really about their own bonus or promotion.
And this focus on the short term seems key, willing to burn bridges, exploit trust, even fake results for immediate gain.
Exactly. Research points to how their manipulation skills let them create these illusions of success. Maybe inflating numbers, rushing things through unsafely to get that quick win. They might benefit personally, but it exposes the organization to huge long-term risks.
And we keep coming back to how they manipulate power dynamics, sacrificing colleagues, shifting blame, taking credit. It's fundamentally unethical.
And their indifference to the consequences makes it possible. They just don't feel the guilt or responsibility that would stop most people. It creates that toxic environment where people feel used, disposable, collaboration just dies.
And as we said, this corrodes the whole organizational culture. Their behavior sets a really negative tone.
When leaders act unethically, it signals that it's acceptable. It can make others more competitive, more ruthless, because they see that being rewarded. Deliberately dividing teams just to stay in control is a prime example of how damaging this can be.
And they seem to be very good at justifying it all to themselves and maybe to others, rationalizing bad behavior.
Yes, that rationalization is a huge problem. Minimizing harm, framing misconduct as tough but necessary. When leaders do that, it sets a dangerous precedent. Others start to think it's okay, and you get this downward spiral of ethical standards.
Which ultimately means a decline in the quality of leadership itself, if the focus is purely on self-advancement.
There's little genuine concern for the long-term health of the organization or the well-being of the people in it. They prioritize quick wins, sideline others' contributions. Teams feel undervalued. People get demotivated. Good employees leave. It hurts the organization's ability to succeed in the long run.
So tackling these ethical issues needs a really proactive approach. Strong ethical codes, accountability, building a culture of integrity from the top down.
Okay, let's broaden it out again and talk about the overall negative impact on organizational culture. Trust seems like the first casualty.
Absolutely. That lack of empathy, the self-serving manipulation, the willingness to deceive or betray, it just demolishes trust. When people see colleagues acting like that, especially if they get away with it, it creates this atmosphere of suspicion, conflict, makes teamwork incredibly difficult.
And morale just tanks, right? If you see this stuff happening, maybe even rewarded, you lose faith. Yeah, the sources are clear on that. Things like credit stealing, blame shifting,
Yeah.
they're hugely demotivating. People feel undervalued, constantly looking over their shoulder. That anxiety takes a massive toll on well-being and commitment.
And those power struggles we talked about, deliberately creating rivalry and instability that just further poisons the culture.
Right. Setting teams against each other might give the manipulator short-term control, but it rips apart any sense of shared purpose. You end up with internal competition instead of collaboration towards common goals.
And the impact on employees just sounds awful. Constant pressure, unfair competition, no recognition. Leads to stress, dissatisfaction.
Definitely. People working under these conditions often face mental health struggles, more stress, more anxiety,
Yeah.
and the lack of real support from leadership makes it worse. Often leads to higher turnover. People just vote with their feet and leave for healthier places.
Maybe the most worrying thing, though, is how it can undermine the ethical standards of the whole place. One person's bad example becomes contagious.
That's a huge risk. When leaders disregard ethics, it sends a very loud message. Others might feel they have to cut corners or act unethically too, just to keep up or get ahead. It can lead to a systemic erosion of integrity. Think misleading shareholders, pressuring people into illegal acts. Those are extreme but possible outcomes.
It's like the organization's values get hollowed out from the inside, really damaging its reputation and future. So we've seen the big picture damage. Let's drill down now to the direct impact on the people working alongside them, subordinates and colleagues.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty grim picture here. Controlling subordinates seems like a common pattern.
How does that work? Spotting weaknesses and exploiting them.
Often, yes. Identifying vulnerabilities, imposing impossible demands, then blaming the subordinate when things go wrong. It keeps people constantly off balance, insecure. And we've mentioned how they sow discord within teams, to isolating people, fueling rivalry, maybe holding back information.
Keeping everyone disconnected and reliant on them.
It seems like it solidifies their control. And it's not just subordinates peers get exploited too. Taking credit for a colleague's idea, downplaying their contributions. It breeds resentment and destroys peer relationships.
And that psychological pressure, subtle threats, coercion. The example, your failure will let the entire team down. That's nasty.
Classic guilt tripping. Puts immense unfair pressure on one person. And they generally don't seem to value genuine trust. Interactions are transactional, self-serving. Naito Yoshihido's research suggests, yeah, they might be good at using people, but it wrecks the trust needed for real success.
And the pattern of making huge demands without support, then taking credit for wins but blaming the team for losses.
Creates a totally unfair, demotivating setup. And sometimes it goes further, actively sabotaging colleagues, maybe bad-mouthing them, spreading rumors, undermining their work.
Just creates this awful atmosphere of distrust and stress. It's all about manipulating people for personal gain, hitting them where they're weakest. Let's explore that idea of deliberately creating confusion and division a bit more. That seems like a core strategy.
It really does. It's about weakening team cohesion to bolster their own position.
Yeah.
Actively stirring up conflict, competition. It stops strong alliances forming that could challenge them. Unfair performance reviews are a classic example, cited creating favorites, undermining others.
Yeah, basing things on politics, not performance, kills morale and teamwork.
And manipulating information, just withholding it, it's a key way to create confusion. If people don't have the data they need, they're at a disadvantage. Easier to control, easier to blame later, like not sharing crucial project risks.
Sets the team up to fail while the manipulator stays clear.
The divide and rule thing also extends to resources. Unevenly distributing budgets, opportunities, it breeds resentment, creates factions, again, makes it easier for them to stay in control.
Just constantly undermining any sense of shared purpose or fairness.
And they often actively fuel power struggles, maybe feeding bad information upwards, damaging colleagues' reputations to make themselves look better. It destabilizes everything, pulls focus away from actual work onto internal fighting.
And the bottom line of all this confusion and division, it hurts the organization's performance. Badly.
Oh, absolutely. Projects get delayed, good people leave, morale craters, innovation dries up. It's a mess.
So they might get ahead personally in the short term.
But it's almost always at the expense of the team's health and the organization's long-term success. Their advancement comes first, even if it means sacrificing everything else.
Really highlights why transparency and fairness, fair evaluations, open communication are so vital as defenses against this. Okay, let's talk about behaviors that might be, strictly speaking, legal, but still cause immense harm.
Yeah, this is a really important point. A lot of the damaging stuff we've discussed falls into this category. Manipulative leadership, pushing people too hard, exaggerating your own role. It might not be illegal, but it can wreck morale and well-being. Sometimes it gets brushed off as just tough management.
But the impact is real. And avoiding accountability, shifting blame, spinning stories, protects them maybe, but destroys trust.
Exactly. Or exploiting those ethical gray areas.
Yeah.
Like drastic cost-cutting that burns out employees or hurts the company long-term. Might be technically legal, but is it ethical? Often not.
And we see parallels outside work too, right? In politics, maybe spreading misinformation, stoking division, might be legal, but it damages society.
True. And emotional manipulation, making people anxious, fearful with constant pressure or veiled threats. Not a crime, but it leads to burnout, people leaving, creativity shutting down.
So ultimately, these legal but harmful actions chip away at trust, collaboration, ethics. They normalize manipulation and exploitation. Which brings us to the crucial question. What can organizations actually do about this? How do you address non-criminal psychopaths in the workplace?
Well, early identification is key. Performance reviews need to look beyond just hitting targets. They need to really assess how people interact, communicate, work in a team. Look for those patterns of manipulation or excessive conflict.
So don't just look at the what, but the how, and be proactive, not just reactive.
Definitely. Things like decentralized leadership, spreading power out can help. More transparency in decision-making, too. Makes it harder for one person to manipulate things behind the scenes for their own benefit.
And building a strong ethical culture has to be fundamental.
Absolutely. Make ethics a priority, train people on it regularly, and crucially, have clear consequences for unethical behavior, no matter who it is. That sends a powerful message that manipulation isn't tolerated.
Having safe ways for people to report concerns seems vital, too.
Yes, effective whistleblowing systems are important. People need to feel safe raising flags, knowing they'll be protected and taken seriously. Anonymity options help.
And given the stress involved for colleagues, what about support for them?
That's important too, offering things like counseling, stress management support. It helps people cope with difficult dynamics and builds resilience.
And finally, just general transparency and oversight.
Crucial, open communication channels, making sure big decisions have multiple reviewers, collaborative oversight. It reduces the chances for individuals to distort things or act purely out of self-interest. As researchers like Ito Naito suggest, it really takes a multi-pronged approach to detection, structural changes, cultural reinforcement, and support for employees.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive today suggests that these non-criminal psychopaths, even though they might stay within the law, can cause real significant harm in organizations through manipulation, that core lack of empathy, creating toxic, divided workplaces.
Yeah, their actions, while maybe not criminal, just erode trust at all levels. They drag down morale, they disrupt teamwork, and they can seriously undermine the ethical foundations of a company.
And as you've been listening, maybe you've found yourself thinking back to workplaces you've been in, people you've encountered. Perhaps recognizing some of these patterns now gives you a new lens, a new way to understand those experiences.
Exactly. Spotting the patterns is that vital first step. And it leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it? What fundamental changes do we need in our organizational cultures and how we develop leaders to really lessen the harm these individuals cause? How do we build workplaces where genuine collaboration and ethical behavior aren't just hoped for, but actively thrive?
Something important to keep thinking about.